Alright, so I was able to get all the objects working correctly. I got the color, or yeah, the color light, texture light. They all render in properly. I'm gonna go through each one. You gave us the example to go off of for the graphics object, color, and then I went and worked in with texture. This is per mesh. I figured I would just show this one to show that I understood how everything worked. Um, Created all the functions, created the mesh texture array, kept track of the mesh count. Same thing here with the color light. Have all the same function calls as in right over here in the shaders, but passing in obviously the variables necessary to make the shaders work properly. Keeping track of the mesh numbers, iterating through, rendering it correctly. What other one was left? Texture light. Here's the texture light CPP. Very similar to the color light, but this one obviously takes in the texture. Have to set it with the mesh number to make sure it matches whichever mesh you are using that's taking that specific texture. Passing it to the set texture resource and sampler. Sending in all the proper information, and I'm gonna run it. I used the cottage for these 4. So obviously right here, this is the color, texture, color light, texture light. There's just to give make sure that you see that there is light in the scene. There's a directional light. In the previous assignment, I was unable to get the multiple spot and the point lights, but I was able to fix that, and I brought that in. I just didn't put any in the scene. As far as bringing in my own model went, I was unable to properly bring anything in. It was just not working right. Yeah, that I'm gonna continue working on that this weekend. Hopefully, I'm able to bring something in, and that way I can start working on my final project. And as far as the question goes, I believe the question is for different meshes having different shaders. I would probably try to separate everything out. Like in here, it would probably take more than likely take obviously more than one shader, and then create these different functions to separate out which one takes the texture, which one takes light, or whatever the shader does. And then make sure that when you're rendering it in here in the render function, that you are setting it to, again, the correct shader, using the correct shader in here in this render, so that way that you can render whatever it is that you're using, just to make sure that everything just gets separated and properly organized. Let me see what else. Yeah, I think that's where I would get started. Would just be to try to make sure that when you're working with multiple shaders in one graphic object, is to create those separate functions to handle those separate shaders, and then when it comes to the actual rendering, make sure that it is properly called and sent. So yeah, that's for the further works. And like I said, I was trying to get a model in here. It's just it wasn't working. It wouldn't load in properly, and it was just a big fiasco. So I just decided to go with the cottage, so that way I could show that I did all the work, and it was working. Everything was working properly.